Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna,
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna devotees. Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Yes, we can hear you, Prabhu.
Okay. Jai. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Vanchakopatarubhyascha, Kripasindhuvyeva cha, Patitanam Pavanevyo, Vaishnavevyo Namo Namaha. Jaya Radha Madhava, Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava, Kunja Bihari. Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari. Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari. Yashoda Nandana Raja Janaranjana. Yashoda Nandana Raja Janaranjana. Yamunatira Vanachari. Yamunatira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jayam Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajikacharya Ashotatara Shishimad His Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki.
Yay.
Jayam Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajikacharya Ashotatara Shishimad His Divine Grace Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Thakur Maharaj Ki.
Yay.
Anantakoti Vaishnavrinda Ki.
Yay.
Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki.
Yay.
Prem Skoho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Thakur Maharaj Ki. Gaura Bhaktivinoda Ki.
Yay.
Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shama Kund Radha Kund Giri Govardhan ki.
Jai.
Shri Vrindavan Dham ki.
Jai.
Navadvip Mayapur Dham ki.
Jai.
Jagannath Puri Dham ki.
Jai.
Ganga Maya ki.
Jai.
Jamuna Maya ki.
Jai.
Bhakti Devi ki.
Jai.
Tulsi Devi ki.
Jai.
Shri Harinam Sankirtan ki.
Jai.
Antaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki.
Jai.
Samaveta Bhaktivinoda ki.
Jai.
Nitai Gora Premanande.
Hari Hari Bol.
All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories, all glories, all glories to the lotus feet of Shri Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Tirtha Swamini Namane Namaste Krishna Padaya Prabhupada Shatatmane Shri Gaura Kavarna Shakti Bhakti Tirtha Iti Namane Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Narayanam Namaskrityam Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Udirajit Nasta Prayeshu Abhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtuki. Welcome, devotees. Thank you for having me to this morning's Srimad Bhagavatam class. We are beginning a new chapter. We're in Canto 2, Chapter 9, Text 1. Śrī Śuka uvāca ātma-māyām rite rājan parasyānubhavātmanaḥ na ghaṭetārtha-sambandhaḥ svapna-draṣṭur ivāñjasā. Śrī Śuka uvāca ātma-māyām rite rājan parasyānubhavātmanaḥ ghaṭetārtha-sambandhaḥ svapna-draṣṭur ivāñjasā. Śrī Śuka uvāca ātma-māyām rite rājan parasyānubhavātmanaḥ ghaṭetārtha-sambandhaḥ svapna-draṣṭur ivāñjasā. Please chant.
Śrī Śukadeva ātma-māyām rite rājan parasyānubhavātmanaḥ ghaṭetārtha-sambandhaḥ svapna-draṣṭur ivāñjasā. Hare Krishna.
Śrī Śuka uvāca ātma-māyām rite rājan parasyānubhavātmanaḥ na ghaṭetārtha-sambandhaḥ svapna-draṣṭur ivāñjasā. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Śrī Śukadeva ātma-māyām rite rājan parasyānubhavātmanaḥ na ghaṭetārtha-sambandhaḥ svapna-draṣṭur ivāñjasā. Hare Krishna.
Anyone else? Okay, let's go to the word for word. Śrī Śuka uvāca, Śrī Śukadeva Gosvāmī said, Atma, the personality of Godhead. ātma-māyām, energy. Rite, without. Rājan, O king. Parasya, of the pure soul. Anubhavātmanaḥ, of the purely conscious. Na, never. Ghaṭetārtha, it can so happen. Artha, meaning. Sambandhaḥ, relation with the material body. Sapna, dream. Dristu, of the seer. Iva, like. ivāñjasā, completely. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, Śrī Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Śrī Śukadeva Gosvāmī said, O King, unless one is influenced by the energy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, there is no meaning to the relationship of the pure soul in pure consciousness with the material body. That relationship is just like a dreamer's seeing his own body working. Purport. Maharaj Parikshit's question as to how the living entity began his material life, although he is apart from the material body and mind, is perfectly answered. This is kind of a long purport and very detailed, and it's a very important one for us philosophically. Just wanted to mention that so we can make sure that we do our best to tune into this. The spirit soul is distinct from the material conception of his life, but he is absorbed in such a material conception because of being influenced by the external energy of the Lord called ātma-māyām. This has already been explained in the first canto in connection with Vyasadev's realization of the Supreme Lord and his external energy. The external energy is controlled by the Lord, and the living entities are controlled by the external energy, by the will of the Lord. Therefore, although the living entity is purely conscious in his pure state, he is subordinate to the will of the Lord in being influenced by the external energy of the Lord. In the Bhagavad Gita 5:15, also the same thing is confirmed. The Lord is present within the heart of every living entity, and all living entities' consciousness and forgetfulness are influenced by the Lord. Now the next question automatically made will be why the Lord influences the living entity to such consciousness and forgetfulness. The answer is that the Lord clearly wishes that every living entity be in his pure consciousness as part and parcel of the Lord, and thus be engaged in the loving service of the Lord as he is constitutionally made. But because the living entity is partially independent also, he may not be willing to serve the Lord, but may try to become as independent as the Lord is. All the non-devotee living entities are desirous of becoming equally as powerful as the Lord, although they are not fit to become so. The living entities are illusioned by the will of the Lord because they want to become like him. Like a person who thinks of becoming a king without possessing the necessary qualification. When the living entity desires to become the Lord himself, he is put in a condition of dreaming that he is a king. Therefore, the first sinful will of the living entity is to become the Lord. And the consequent will of the The consequent will of the Lord is that the living entity forget his factual life. And thus the dream of the land of utopia, where he may become one like the Lord. The child cries to have the moon from the mother, and the mother gives the child a mirror to satisfying a crying, disturbing child with the reflection of the moon. Similarly, the crying child of the Lord is given over. Similarly, the crying child of the Lord is given over to the reflection, the material world, to lord over as karmi, and to give up in frustration to become one with the Lord. Both these stages are dreaming illusions only. There is no necessity of tracing out the history of when the living entity desired this. But the fact is that as soon as he desired it, he was put under the control of ātma-māyām by the direction of the Lord. Therefore, the living entity, in his material condition, is dreaming falsely that this is mine and this is I. The dream is that the conditioned soul thinks of his material body as I, or falsely thinks that he is the Lord and that everything in connection with the material body is mine. Thus, only in the dream does the misconception of I and mine persist life after life. This continues life after life as long as the living entity is not purely conscious of his identity as the subordinate part and parcel of the Lord. In his pure consciousness, however, there is no such misconceived dream. And in that pure conscious state, the living entity does not forget that he is never the Lord, but that he is eternally the servitor of the Lord in transcendental love. Om Ajnanatimbarandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Swapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. I was born in the darkness of ignorance, and my spiritual master has opened my eyes with the torchlight of knowledge. I offer my respectful obeisances unto him. Translation once again of this verse. Śrī Śukadeva Gosvāmī said, O king, unless one is influenced by the energy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, there is no meaning to the relationship of the pure soul and pure consciousness with the material body. That relationship is just like the dreamer seeing his own body working. Hare Krishna. I had a dream last night. I was reading this. I don't know if it was sparked by this realization from this verse of the Srimad Bhagavatam. I had a dream last night that I was younger and I had borrowed my father's car. Somehow I drove off the road and through the woods, and I hit a tree. and the front of the car was smashed. And I was trying to think about how I was going to present this to my father and how much he was going to be, really upset about it. And I was coming up with all these different scenarios. And all this was going on when I was dreaming. And then I woke up and I was still laying in my bed. I was never in a car. I was not last night, nor was I ever in the woods, nor was my father's car ever damaged. But during the time, the situation was extremely real, to the point where I was feeling emotions of fear. My mind was coming up with scenarios of how I could explain the situation. But as soon as I woke up, all those scenarios disappeared. And the reality of me, that I was asleep, came back. This actually happened to me last night. I didn't try to create that situation to explain this. This actually happened, and we all have dreams. This is a very important philosophical point that is being made by Śrī Śukadeva Gosvāmī to Maharaj Parikshit. And Srila Prabhupada's explanation in the purport is important for us to understand. This question of, why are we here? Why do we exist here in this material world? If we are eternal souls, how did we get here? This question comes up very regularly, and we should understand, to the best of our ability, from the words of Srila Prabhupada, how this happened. The first part of this purport, the first paragraph, Srila Prabhupada is establishing the living entity, his constitutional position. The living entity is the marginal energy of the Supreme Lord. This is stated in the Bhagavad Gita. He is spiritual, but yet he is marginal. This marginal energy is called tatashta. He is fully dependent on the mercy, on the will of the Lord. But because he is part and parcel, made of the same spiritual DNA, he has independent, the living being has minute independence, and thus has desire. Another name for the marginal energy is tatashta shakti. And the tatashta shakti is compared to the space of sand at the brink of the ocean. And as the ocean comes up on high tide, it gets covered over. And at low tide, it becomes dry. So the living entity can be influenced by the external energy or the material energy, or the living entity can be in the spiritual energy at all times, wet or dry. So the point that Srila Prabhupada makes is that let me find it here. The external energy is controlled by the Lord, and the living entities are controlled by the external energy, by the will of the Lord. So when the living entity has a desire to be separate, to enjoy separate from the Lord, that goes into the second paragraph. the Lord then creates the situation for the living entity to reside in the external energy. However, this is like a dreamlike state for the living entity. Because he's part and parcel of the Lord, he's actually never separated from the Lord. I don't want to confuse us here, says there's a statement here. I just want to make clarification of, therefore, although the living entity is purely conscious in his pure state, he is subordinate to the will of the Lord in being influenced by the external energy of the Lord. First comes the desire of the living entity to become the Lord, to enjoy sense gratification, and then the Lord creates the situation where he becomes influenced by the external energy. The living entity is always under the control of the Lord, either directly through the internal potency or externally through the material energy. And the Srila Prabhupada quotes the Bhagavad Gita 15:15. Sarvasya chaham hriday sanavishto matasmitir gyanam apovanam cha. That for me comes knowledge, remembrance, and forgetfulness. That forgetfulness of one's original position as loving servants of Krishna, that can be forgotten. How can that be forgotten? Only by the external energy that's under control of the Supreme Lord. So it says, by the will of the Lord, the living entity becomes covered over by the external energy. It's not that Krishna just wants us to be in the material energy. No, it's because he facilitates that desire of the living entity. The living entity does not have the power on its own to be in the external energy. That's all controlled. Everything is being controlled by Lord Krishna. So that leads to the second part, the second paragraph, and starts off by the next question. So it's very, very thought out. If we're following along, the next question would be, why the Lord influences the living entity to such consciousness and forgetfulness? Why would Krishna do this? As I just mentioned, there is the answer is that the Lord clearly wishes that every living entity be in pure consciousness as a part and parcel of the Lord, and thus be engaged in the loving service of the Lord, as he is constitutionally made. But because the living entity is partially independent, he may not be willing to serve the Lord, but may try to become as independent as the Lord. Thus, so when this happens, that's when the Lord casts the living entities into this material energy. Thus, the living entities are considered to be illusioned by the will of the Lord. But really, the desire comes first from the living entity. This weekend we were celebrating Srila Prabhupada's arrival in America. First, he pulled into Boston Harbor, and he composed some prayers called Markini Bhagavat Dharma, the preaching mission in America, in the Western world. And one of the prayers in the poem that he wrote, he says, all living entities have come under the control of the illusory energy by your will. And therefore, if you like, by your will, they can also be released from the clutches of illusion. So again, this is consistent, that Krishna is in control. Krishna is allowing the living entities to exhibit their free will, creating this material world. But we should always understand that it is Krishna, Krishna's energy, that is allowing all this to happen. At no point is the living entity fully in control. So even to come out of the illusory energy, we are also dependent on Krishna. Just as Krishna allows us to forget our spiritual identity and to identify as a material body, Krishna can also, we can't forget that we're a material body and remember that we're Krishna without Krishna's power of allowing us to remember and then also forget the material energy. So this is the constitutional position of the living entity. Now, there are some questions that have come up, philosophical questions, over time. Some of you may have encountered it. And that question is, have we always existed here in this material world? Did we ever really fall from the spiritual world? Is it possible to fall from the spiritual world? If everything is pure in consciousness, how could we possibly fall? Now, Srila Prabhupada answers this question. Srila Prabhupada was asked this question numerous times by disciples. I've researched this a little bit, not to the fullest extent, but my understanding from the GBC's perspective on this, from Srila Prabhupada's perspective on this, and Srila Prabhupada was very clear that we originated from the spiritual world and we left the spiritual world into the material world, and that situation was created by Krishna. At the same time, there's no doubt that to try to really understand with our limited minds exactly how it happened and when it happened is inconceivable, and is an inconceivable mental exercise that we can only take but so far. Srila Prabhupada, he gives the example. There's a letter that was written on this topic to Madhudvisha Prabhu. And if you want to study this, it's in Los Angeles, May of 16th, 1972. Los Angeles, May 16th, 1972, letter to Madhudvisha. And he creates, and he attaches a pretty lengthy explanation about the fall of the spirit soul into the material world. He concludes that he calls it the crow and the tall fruit logic, that sitting above the tree, there's a fruit. And when the crow lands on the tree, the fruit falls. So seeing this, there were a couple of logicians, and one of them said, the fruit fell because the crow knocked it off, because the crow wanted to eat it. And another one said, the fruit was ripe, just ripe at the time, and when the crow landed, it knocked it off. Another one said it actually fell just before the crow had landed. And they're sitting there and arguing. But at the end of the day, the fruit is lying on the ground, and it is to be eaten. It's hard to understand how these things happen, but yet we can spend our time trying to understand, but we won't truly ever fully understand. So Srila Prabhupada advised us not to overly consume ourselves with trying to understand the details of our fall into this world. An excerpt from that letter. Well, there's a lot here. I may not be able to cover it all. But an excerpt from the letter, Srila Prabhupada also mentions about, our job right now is that, like a diseased person, they're in the hospital. Their job is to get well and not necessarily try to figure out why they've been injured or diseased, but to get well. He also gives the example of there's a fire in the house. We can figure out later on how the fire started. But if we try to figure it out, we may miss the opportunity and actually get burned in the house. So first consideration is to get out. And this process of Krishna consciousness is the process of getting back out. So in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, there's a verse that states that Nitya Siddha Krishna Prema Sada Kabanai Shavanari Sudachite Kare Uradai. This is from the Majjhima Lila 22:107. The pure love of Krishna is eternally established in the hearts of the living entities. It is not something to be gained from another source. When the heart is purified by hearing and chanting, this love naturally awakens. So pure love of Krishna is eternally, this is Lord Chaitanya, pure love of Krishna is eternally established in the heart of the living entities. So that exists, but it's covered over by our material desires to become one with Krishna. Some may conclude, so one of the confusion points is sometimes we hear these two terms, Nitya Bara and Nitya Siddha. Eternally liberated or eternally bound. This word Nitya sometimes refers to our eternal position. Sometimes it also refers to an extremely long period of time. Eternally liberated, eternally bound, or always liberated, always bound. Being in this material world, Srila Prabhupada uses the terminology since time immemorial, meaning that we can't trace it back. And sometimes we try to think, okay, was it 3 lifetimes ago, 8 lifetimes ago, 12 lifetimes ago? Was it back in Dwapara Yuga? Was it Treta Yuga? We can't figure this out. They have these genealogy tests where you can trace back your ancestors going back, and you can find out who they were a couple generations. You can find out, okay, in Italy, my father was my great 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 grandfather was a peasant farmer, and you can trace this out. So they can take DNA and they have some type of family trees that they develop for you. But you can't do that and trace out the source of, we're the living entity and when it fell into this material world. But we try to do so In the Upanishad, the third mantra, Srila Prabhupada explains how rare this human form of life is. That it is only in the human form of life that we can cross over this ocean of material existence. But we often forget that this material body, that this human form of life is a gift. And sometimes we take it for granted that we'll always have this gift. And we're not cognizant of the fact that we've gone through millions of births just to get to this human form of life, traveling through different species in different time periods. And we've forgotten this. And therefore, to not take full advantage of the human form of life is the greatest misfortune of the living entity. In fact, according to the Upanishad, it says that one that doesn't fulfill the purpose of human life for self-realization, which in its most matured stage comes to devotional service to Krishna, then one is actually the killer of the soul. Another verse where Srila Prabhupada talks about this topic is the fourth canto, text number 53 through 55. And there's the and here there is the allegory of the fall of the living entity from the spiritual world. I'll just read it real quickly. The Brahmana continued, "My dear friend, even though you cannot immediately recognize me, can't you remember that in the past you had a very intimate friend? Unfortunately, you gave up my company and accepted the position as an enjoyer of this material world." Text 54. "My dear gentle friend, both you and I are exactly like two swans. We live together in the same heart, which is just like the Manasa lake. Although we have been living together for many thousands of years, we are still far away from our original home." And in this purport, Srila Prabhupada says, the original home of the living entity is the Supreme Personality, and the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the spiritual world. In the spiritual world, both the Lord and the living entities live together very peacefully. Since the living entity remains engaged in the service of the Lord, they both share a blissful life in the spiritual world. However, when the living entity wants to enjoy himself, he falls down into this material world. Even while he is in that position, the Lord remains with him as Supersoul, as his intimate friend. Because of his forgetfulness, the living entity does not know that the Supreme Lord is accompanying him as the Supersoul. In this way, the living entity remains conditioned in each and every millennium. Although the Lord follows him as a friend, the living entity, because of forgetful material existence, does not recognize him. And then lastly, 55. "My dear friend, you are now my very same friend. Since you left me, you have become more and more materialistic. And not seeing me, you have been traveling in different forms throughout this material world, which was created by some woman." This woman that's referring to is Prakriti, or material nature. In the purport, and I'm reading this because I just want to make sure that there's confusion in Srila Prabhupada's consistency, that we came from the material world. Excuse me, we didn't come from the material. We fell into the material world from the spiritual world. Purport. When the living entity falls down, he goes into the material world, which was created by the external energy of the Lord. This external energy is described herein as some woman or Prakriti. This material world is composed of the material elements, ingredients supplied by the Mahatattva, the total material energy. So it may appear that the living entity is born out of this material, this Mahatattva. But we know from the Bhagavad Gita that from the very beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, the soul is eternal. Natvevaham jatu nasam. Najayate mriyate vakarachin. Doesn't have birth, doesn't have a beginning. So just like the example that the living entity comes from the material world, Srila Prabhupada gives the example of a scorpion being born from rice. Because it looks like you have a bucket of rice and a scorpion comes out of it. So one thinks that the scorpion was born out of rice. But those that have an understanding understand that scorpion was actually born out of the eggs that were embedded within the rice. So it looks like we are born out of this material energy, this Mahatattva, the material elements that supply everything. But actually, we're eternal spirit souls. What I'll do is I'll stop here and see if there's any discussion on this. There's more to be said. And this letter that Srila Prabhupada, it's a little bit lengthy, so I couldn't read it. But it's very important for us to understand philosophically the position of the spirit soul and, how it has fallen into this material existence to the best that we can possibly understand, as Srila Prabhupada has explained to us. So I'll stop here and see if we have any discussion or questions about this, and we can continue the discussion after that. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. So thank you very much, Guru, for giving such a very nice, thought-provoking class, and especially this whole thing of people saying that, well, we didn't fall from the spiritual world. We were here originally. And of course, Srila Prabhupada explains that. I'm glad you gave references to that, from the Upanishad, Bhagavatam, Srila Prabhupada's letters. And so, devotees, this is the time to unmute yourself if you have questions. And so you can have a nice discussion about this. So are there any questions? If not, then I'll start off by please step on the basis of God's good if Prabhupada. The letter from Srila Prabhupada. It's to Madhudvisa Prabhu. You quoted the date because I'd like to look at it and read the whole thing of what is it's 1972, but what's the month?
So the date is May 16th, 1972.
Okay, so I got it right. All right. So a letter from Srila Prabhupada to Madhudvisa Prabhu.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe Prabhupada Vani, maybe I'll be able to find it there at some point.
Yeah. If you just Google it.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can
probably come up.
I can put it in the chat here. Let me see if it'll come the link. Just put in the chat.
Okay.
So I don't know if that chat remains active after the class ends, but if you do kind of Google it, Madhudvisa, Madhudvisa, May 16th, 1972.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think the chat, I may be wrong, but it may be possible to, that you can copy from the chat directly. You can just take a mouse and copy it. So thank you very much for giving the information there. Yeah, I'd like to read it. So any questions, Who? Please unmute yourself, ask a question, make a comment. Any takeaways that you want to discuss? Or just bring it up that actually struck you that you'd like to discuss? This purport is very extensive, and it's just the consciousness and the forgetfulness and why the Lord put us in forgetfulness. It's all explained here so nicely. It's worth even going back to read it. And this is the first text of Canto 2, Chapter 9. The very first text, 291. Mhm. It's a big eye-opener for everyone. Okay.
In that letter to Madhudvesha Prabhu, Srila Prabhupada explains this same idea of a dreamlike state.
Mm.
So it's very consistent with what the Bhagavatam is saying that here, that even though when we're dreaming, we feel that we may be away for a very long time,
Mm.
we actually wake up from the dream and it's only an instant. You feel like it's only an instant. And he gives the example of the cowherd boys. You know, even though when Lord Brahma, kidnapped them and they were asleep for 1 year of Brahma, but when they woke up, Krishna returned before them, they considered that only a moment had passed.
Mm-hmm.
In this dreamlike state, when the dream is over and we return to our original position, we just come right back. And I've heard other devotees talk. Mother Sangeeta, she said that she also heard Srila Prabhupada talk about this directly in a lecture, that when we return to our pure state of Krishna consciousness, it's like we're almost like daydreaming. It seems like a person daydreaming, they're like lost in thought, and you kind of give them a little nudge, and then they get startled, and then they return back to their activities. Of course, we can't fully understand with our limited minds. It is inconceivable when we try to understand that we're traveling through all these different species of life. How can this be possible? And all we see is the world today, and we know about the history for maybe a couple thousands of years at best. And we really can't understand, what different planetary systems we've traveled through, and it becomes bewildering. And so the term that sometimes confuses people, this like anadi karma or beginningless karma. Well, if it's beginningless, where do we, does that mean we were always here in this material world? If we were nitya bada, always conditioned, it just means that we were here for a very, very, very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And did we come from Mahavishnu? Well, during different creation cycles, all the living entities, they go back into the Mahatattva, or back into, Mahavishnu, and then they come out like that they come out of the pore as everything goes back in to the pores and then comes back out of the pores of Vishnu. So this is happening, but this is happening only in different creation cycles, not at the original, but not our original position. And that's not our original condition, but this is happening in the midst of these, unlimited periods of time that we've been here in this material world. So this part gets a little bit, I think, confusing to people. Talks about, even in the Brahma Jyoti, that because of the original desires to become one with the Lord, we can remain in the Brahma Jyoti, in this Brahma Sayuja Mukti. But this is also not permanent, because the living entity desires pleasure, Satchit Ananda. So this Ananda isn't present in the Brahma Sayuja Mukti. So Srila Prabhupada explains how they eventually we can fall out of the Brahma Jyoti back into the material world. And when that happens, people, they fall back down, and then they desire to do some humanitarian work, because that'll give them, they're still looking for pleasure, but they reject the idea that Krishna is the center, that our pleasure can actually be found in service to Krishna. So they still try to find some pleasure in material existence, satisfaction.
And Sayyidya Mukti is what?
The Brahma Sayuja Mukti, it's this liberation in the Brahma Jyoti, merging into the Brahman.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
Srila Prabhupada explains it in this letter.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Any other comments? One comment I'd like to make is I've always, thought about this, that those who say we were here in the material world, and we also know the material world is temporary, and it's also a very difficult place. You have to strive and make so many trials in life. And just by my own mind putting two and two together, I say, well, the Lord is so loving, the Lord is so kind, the Lord is so just, so many positive things are there about the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And he has living entities. And he would decide that some living entities stay in the spiritual world forever, and some living entities come in the material world to start difficulty when he's not loving. It just doesn't compute in my mind. You read me what Prabhupada said. He said we fell from the spiritual world. That makes a whole lot of sense to me. I could easily relate to that. Where people say, oh, but we were in the material world. And I know they quote some things from the Bhagavad Gita. When a person returns to the material world, he doesn't fall back down. Therefore, he must have been in the material world the whole time because he was in the spiritual world. He wouldn't fall back down. So all of these arguments, they don't hold water. They don't, because the Lord that's that loving will not put people. Loving people don't put people in difficulty right from the get-go when they haven't done anything wrong. So that's the way I put that, in my mind. That's how it computes. And I believe Srila Prabhupada totally.
Yeah.
This was put out there. Hare Krishna.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I had this conversation with a devotee recently, and they had brought it up actually in a Bhagavatam class, which I was really surprised about. So I had to question them privately afterwards because I wanted to see what angle they were coming from.
Mm.
And I said, well, even philosophically, if we say that we were never in the spiritual world, that we're always in this material world, that means that there are some living entities that are in the pure state that are in the spiritual world. These Nitya-siddhas, always liberated beings. That means that there were some living entities that are always living in this material world. That means that Krishna decided that some of you are going to be suffering and some of you are always going to be liberated. I said, so therefore, Krishna made that decision for us that we will be here suffering in this material world. That means that Krishna is responsible for our sin. Krishna is responsible for us being here in this material world. It is not because of my doing, it's because of Krishna's doing. But Krishna also says in the Bhagavad Gita, he says, I am not responsible for the sinful activities of the living entity. Right? It takes the accountability away from us and puts it onto Krishna. I don't know why I'm here. Krishna put me here. It's not my fault that it's not due to my material desires or my desire to be separate from Krishna. So it doesn't make any sense. We're putting the blame on Krishna for being here in this material world. So I said philosophically, it's not very sound. At least it's not consistent with what, we're taught. A more dangerous aspect of this is that, and I'm not sure where this speculation necessarily comes from, is that Srila Prabhupada, he spoke about this in a way to his Western audience so that we would feel accountable for feel accountable and responsible for being in the material world. But he didn't really believe that Srila Prabhupada really adhered to this idea that we always existed here in this material world. But he didn't speak that way, because his Western disciples couldn't understand this. So that is a really far reach. I mean, there is that speculation that is kind of circulating out there. And I was speaking to Bhattacharya Prabhu. I believe I think he's on the schedule to give class tomorrow. And he's been researching this a lot because it came across him as well when he had heard devotees speaking in this way. And this is devotees in modern time, like within the last year, speaking in this way. And he had to challenge it in his community as well. But we were talking about it. And he said, well, even that doesn't make any sense because Srila Prabhupada started the Back to Godhead magazine back in 1944, 20-some years before he even came over to the West. So it's not that Srila Prabhupada, this terminology, we're back home, back to Godhead. We're going back to Godhead. We're returning back home, not going to a place where we never had been before.
Mm-hmm.
So, so these things, we have to understand that at a certain level, it's inconceivable. But our ontological position as eternal servants of Krishna, as Lord Chaitanya says, we have Krishna prema inside of our hearts. It is embedded within the living entity that we've just been covered over. Nitya Siddha Krishna prema. This is eternally within us, this Krishna prema. That's another good verse to read to understand, and that is the CC Madhya Lila, chapter 22, text 107. That section there. I know a lot of devotees, they refer to Jiva Gosvāmī, who bring up this argument that this comes from the Sandarbhas of Srila Jiva Gosvāmī. But you have to also ask the question, are we qualified to try to understand Jiva Gosvāmī? Whose translation of Jiva Gosvāmī are we using? And also, forgive me if I'm misspeaking here, but do we think we understand Jiva Gosvāmī better than Srila Prabhupada and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta knew Jiva Gosvāmī? Srila Prabhupada is our founder Acharya. And we understand the mood of the previous acharyas through our current acharya. So that also has to be considered. Anyway, it's an interesting topic. Thank you, Parikshit Prabhu, for that. I don't know if there's anything more you want to, or any other devotee wants to explain.
Yeah. Any other questions? Any other comments? You can raise your hand or unmute yourself and join in. It's past the hour, but final comments from anybody? Okay, I'm not hearing anything. So thank you. Very thought-provoking lecture with so many good references and something we can even refer to, and now read the whole letter from Srila Prabhupada to Madhya Prabhu. And there are other references in the CC Madhya 22.107. That also is good reading information. And Śrī Śukadeva also, the third invocation. So this was in the third mantra.
Third mantra, yeah.
Thank you very, very much.
Also this verse from the fourth canto, chapter 28, 53 to 55. This is Parajana becomes a woman in the next life. Yeah.
It's fourth canto, chapter
28.
Okay. Fourth canto, chapter 28. And what else? The text?
Specifically 53 to 55.
Okay. 53 to 55. 428, 53 to 55. Okay. I don't know that too. Thank you very much. You've given us so much to read at the beginning of the weekday, which is wonderful. Hare Krishna. All right, dear buddy. Jai. Vanchakalpatarubhyasya kripa sindhya eva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Śrīla Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you again, people. Thank you, devotees.
Thank you, devotees.
Have a nice and wonderful Krishna conscious day. Jai. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.